today we're going to be taking a look at 10 of the most underrated Pokemon in Regulation F and how to use them. Now, if you guys missed yesterday's video, I essentially did a breakdown using the Lab Mouse, a great, fantastic website, by the way, if you haven't seen it or used it before. I'll link it down below, check it out, it's fantastic. But essentially what we did was we had a look at the top 10 most used Pokemon across 3 big tournaments, all with roughly about 100 plus players. And we essentially just had a look at, hey, what, Pokemon have really good matchups into, the top 10 threats, right? Essentially, I went through just 5 ones that I personally picked. And essentially, today is basically us just expanding on that, right? Now we're going to, kind of dive deeper into, each of these Pokemon, or at least some of the ones, 10 of the better ones that I've picked. And we're going to kind of break down their sets, talk about where to use them, and exactly how to play them. So the first one we're going to touch on here is Urshifu single strike form. Now I have already gone and pre-done all the sets here, guys, because normally I would sit here and actually build them for you guys, but there are a lot of Pokemon to talk about today, and I really don't want to sit here for any longer than I need to. So the first one though we're going to be talking about is Urshifu single strike. Now this one is just a fantastic one in the metagame. When you look at obviously its counterpart being the Urshifu rapid strike, it is one of the most polarizing Pokemon in the game, right? Obviously everyone knows the Taunt Urshifu combo is one of the most oppressive we have in the metagame, and because of that a lot of people really try to make sure their team doesn't lose to Urshifu rapid strike. One of the best answers to Urshifu rapid strike of course as well is Ogerpon. Ogerpon being arguably the second best Pokemon in the game right now, and I'm sure some of the top players would even argue it's potentially better than Fluttermane just because of how versatile the Pokemon is. But Urshifu single strike does not have some of the same issues that our rapid strike friend does. This is a Pokemon where with Choice Band and Terra Dark, its Wicked Blow really just punches a hole through everything outside of really opposing Dark types and Fairy types. Now, while Urshifu single strike doesn't really have a great matchup into Fairy types, it does really rely on its allies to kind of deal with them. It can obviously deal with its other weakness, or other, resist being the Dark typing by easily just clicking the close combats onto it, right? Now, as I said, this is a mod, in my opinion, is probably the most, I don't even want to call it the most underrated, because I feel like everyone's been talking about this one recently, and it's really rising in usage. And because of that, I probably shouldn't even have it on this list. But essentially, we have 3 different sets here that I'm going to talk about that I do think are very good. The first is the Terra Dark Choice Band set. This set here essentially wants to play with speed control, right? Either you want to pair this up with something like Fluttermane with a booster energy and, Icy Wind, or, even a, for example, something like Regieleki or Iron Bundle as well. Or, of course, you pair it with a Tailwind setter, of course, like Tornadus and Whimsicott. It just does a lot of damage. This one with Terra Dark in particular and Choice Band can really threaten to one-shot a lot of very good Pokemon with Wicked Blow. There are a lot of mons like Entei, for example, even that just kind of fold to it, right? Choice Band plus Terra Dark is absolutely absurd. Coming off a move like this that is guaranteed crit, obviously is very, very powerful. Now, the next set that I want to touch on here is the Choice Scarf variant. Now, the Choice Scarf variant is a bit different. This is a set, again, that does kind of like to play with a little bit of speed control, but it also really likes pairing up with a Pokemon that has access to something like Helping Hand. A very common set for Urshifu Dark with the Choice Scarf is pairing it up with a lot of Psy Spam teams or just Trick Room in general, and they tend to pair it up with something like Indeedee because, if your opponent is trying to stop your Trick Room from going up, say, for example, I don't know, they have something like Trick Room, so they have an Imprisoned Pokemon with Trick Room, or, their goal is like, hey, we're just going to overwhelm them turn 1, like, just kind of break them maybe with, double spread moves. Something, of course, like Fluttermane plus, say, Chi-Yu, for example. Just go Dazzling Gleam, Heat Wave, Dazzling Gleam, Snarl, whatever it may be, and kind of just put so much pressure on the board that even if they get the Trick Room up, it feels really bad. And Urshifu single strike just slots onto those teams perfectly because with Choice Scarf and Helping Hand on your Trick Room setter, especially something like, the female Indeedee, you can just say, hey, I've got the speed control with the Choice Scarf. I'm kind of, picking up for that lack of damage that we, kind of lacking because we dropped the Choice Band. But now I have Helping Hand that kind of makes it go, brr. But I do think on these sets as well, Terra Dark is definitely fine, but I did kind of want to mix up the Terras on these sets. I'm sure as we'll go through the video, you'll definitely see where I've got like, hey, Terra Poison here. I'm not necessarily saying Terra Poison is the best on a Scarf Shifu, but it's definitely a good option as well, especially if you don't want to just, fold things like Fluttermane, especially too if you do think your team has a weakness, to example, a speed boost to Fluttermane. You might say, hey, I really don't want to just die to a Dazzling Gleam. Because of that, Terra Poison's a great option. But yeah, I do think the Scarf Shifu definitely has a lot of potential. I do think it needs to be paired up with something that kind of amps it, whether that be Chant Power or Helping Hand Mon, but it is definitely a very solid variant. And then the final variant of Urshifu single strike here I want to touch on is the the Focus Sash set. I have Terra Steel there. That is actually wrong. That's meant to be Terra Stella. I'll quickly just fix that up here. Don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. Terra Stella is just, yeah, another really good option. One of the main reasons I really like Terra Stella on this one in particular is because when you're running the Focus Sash, obviously you're going to get intimidated, right? Now, Intimidate doesn't necessarily matter when you're clicking something like Wicked Blow, but it does for you close combats. And a lot of the time, things like, Incineroar, for example, they can come in, they can intimidate you, fake you out, and then, kind of pivot around from there. Because Incineroar obviously does not care that much about the Wicked Blows, but it does care about the close combats. And of course, with the, the Focus Sash, it gives you the option of Protect. And then, of course, Terra Stella close combat kind of makes up for the, that lack of damage you had being -1, and it can fire off a really strong close combat. Also, I guess I'll quickly touch on the EVs since I didn't really touch on them. I do have the exact same set for all of them. Essentially, look, if you want to run a little bulkier, you can. I just feel like if you're going to run this mon, essentially you just want to nuke, right? That's why I've got the exact same set for all of them. I do think a lot of the Urshifus need Adamant Nature. You could maybe argue on the Banded set, Jolly's okay. But again, I feel like you want that little bit of extra damage because this mon's job really is just to deal as much damage as possible. And when you're running the Adamant Nature, obviously you can, threaten a lot of one-shots that you can't if you're running something like Jolly. And in particular, especially when you look at things like Rapid Strike. Rapid Strike is notorious for just missing KOs with the, the Jolly nature, and that's why they run Adamant. But I do think Urshi Single Strike is one of the best mons in the metagame, and I do think these are 3 of the best ways to play it. Now, the next mon we're going to be touching on here is Galarian Zapdos. Now, this, I'm sure, is a bit of a surprise to most people. Galarian Zapdos is not a mon we've really seen too much, but it has had very good results over the past weekend. One of the main reasons really, obviously, is, it has Defiant. Defiant is one of the best abilities in the game, especially with things like Incineroar and, Landorus Therian always running around with, Intimidate. Being able to turn their, -1 into a +1 for yourself, obviously, is fantastic. And 2, the other big thing I think Galarian Zapdos has going for it is probably the, best, fastest choice scarf that we have in the metagame right now. You could definitely opt to go for something like the Adamant Nature, especially on the choice scarf set, because when you look at a lot of the mons that do kind of contend with it, obviously talking about the Landoruses and the Urshifus, they both do tend to run Adamant, or at least, in Landorus's case, it does run, sometimes it goes Jolly, but they normally go to around Jolly 150 to outspeed the Adamant Urshifus, and they'll never really calc for a Galarian Zapdos. The only real issue I have with going, an Adamant Nature over Jolly is the speed boost, the Iron Crowns that are running around. They do tend to run Timid now because they want to get the speed booster to outspeed things like Xian Pao and one-shot them in terrain. Obviously using Tachyon, Cutter Break, and do the Focus Sash. So because of that, I do just have the Jolly max. But essentially what this mon does really good is it says, 1, I outspeed basically everything in the metagame, or at least, all the common choice scarfers. And then 2, with a Terra Flying Brave Bird, it can threaten a one-shot onto a lot of Pokemon. Things like Fluttermane just fall over to a Terra Flying Brave Bird. I'm pretty sure Fluttermane even falls over without the Brave Bird, if I'm being honest. So that is obviously very, very good. And 2, this mon just has a lot of good utility, right? Knockoff is fantastic, obviously, into the Ghost types. Even things like Golden Go that you can't hit with, Brave Bird and Close Combat. Obviously, having knockoff is just great. And then obviously utility on a Scarf mon or just, a very fast mon in general is always very, very good. But the other set I want to touch on here is one that I'll kind of expand on as well with our next mon, and that is the Covet Cloak set. So basically, Covet Cloak has really started picking up in, usage, especially on some of these Defiant mons, because of the way it basically, pairs you up into things like, obviously, why am I blanking? Incineroar, right? Even things like Speed Booster, Fluttermane as well, it's pretty good into. So essentially, the reason for Covet Cloak is like, 1, you can't get faked out, right? So when you go up against something like Incineroar, it's like, hey, you've just given me +1 and you can't fake me out, which means I can threaten a close combat into that slot, and it really puts Incineroar in this weird spot because it's like, yeah, maybe you could fake out the, the ally, but maybe the ally is just like a Fluttermane. It's like, okay, well, I'm on a board state where I can't really do anything. Sure, I could maybe Terra, but then I'm pinned, and then it just puts you in these really, really weird spots, right? So because of that, I do think Covet Cloak is fantastic. It is also really good, as I mentioned earlier, against things like, Icy Wind Fluttermane, right? This is something we saw, I believe, Chopper Cross do at the Portland Regional. And it basically just says like, hey, sorry, I should kind of expand on that idea. People were pairing, Icy Wind Fluttermane with things like Banded Urshidark, Specs Chi-Yu. And the main reason for it was like, hey, okay, this mon, it's pretty quick, right? It's around that base 100 speed tier. But, you can run something like an Adamant Nature and then use, Fluttermane plus a Tailwind setter as your speed control. Kind of allowing it's like, hey, okay, my Urshifu, while it's naturally slower than the Zapdos, with the speed booster, obviously I can Icy Wind, and then allow it to outspeed things like the Galarian Zapdos, and also the Ogerpon Ogerpon Grass as well, which is what we'll touch on in the next one. But basically that just says, hey, you can't drop my speed, and because of that, I'm just going to nuke your friend, I'm going to nuke you. And it's very, very good. On this set as well, I put Terra Steel just because obviously one of this mon's biggest weaknesses obviously is the fairy types, and Fluttermane in particular can be a bit of an issue. But of course as well, things like Terra Ghost I think are also pretty decent, especially, maybe not necessarily on the Covet Cloak set, but if you are running, maybe the Choice Scarf variant of it, I do think it's a pretty decent option. Now, I did just say Ogerpon, Teal Mask in particular is very, very good. As I said, we saw Chopper Cross use this to great success. Essentially, what this mon did really, really well was, very similar to what we said with Zapdos. It's like, hey, you can, intimidate me, that's fine. I'll get my +1. And with the Covet Cloak, you can't fake me out, and then I can threaten you with a superpower, which is very, very strong. And it puts Incineroar in this weird spot where it's like, are you really going to, Terra your Incineroar turn 1? Probably not, because of that you're going to cycle it out, but then all of a sudden, like, whatever you're cycling it into has to eat a +1 attack off an Ogerpon, which is very, very scary. And one of the great things I think Ogerpon does have going for it is, again, a lot of the choice Scarfers right now are running the Adamant Nature. And while obviously Ogerpon here is not a choice Scarfer, when it Terras, it gets +1 to its speed stat, which obviously, again, is very, very good. Especially too when this mon really wants to be able to, threaten things like Floodmane with a one-shot, right? So I do think the Adamant Nature is very, very good on this one. And essentially, again, Cover Cloak's there because one, it's like, hey, you can't Icy Wind, drop me with something like a Speed Booster Flutter or a Speed Booster, Iron Bundle, which, let's be honest, Iron Bundle is probably just going to freeze dry and kill you anyway. But, Speed Booster Fluttermane is pretty common right now. It's like, hey, you're going to try Icy Wind me. You're not going to drop my speed. I'm also going to Terror, so I potentially am just faster than you anyway. It's going to deal a lot of damage. And yeah, it's really good. This one has a very, cool matchup into the current metagame. Obviously, it's a redirection one. It can redirect spores coming out of Amoonguss. Obviously, it fires off a very, very powerful Grass Stab. And then, of course, Spiky Shield, Superpower. They're just very, very solid moves. Now, we did just mention, the good old Chopper Cross with, Ogerpon. Glimmora is another one that Chopper Cross just really kind of put on the map at the Portland Regional Championships, and that is using the Power Herb Meteor Beam set. Now, look, obviously, we didn't get to touch on the Terra with the last guy, so I'll touch on it quickly here. Glimmora does have a couple of different options it can run. Things like Terra Flying, I think, are pretty decent as well on this mon, but I do think Grass obviously covers his spawn up really, really well. Essentially, this mon wants to tank as many hits as possible to get its Toxic Debris off, and obviously with things like Urshifu Rapid Strike running around, having something like Terra Grass obviously is very, very good. And of course, there are a lot of mons out there that are running ground coverage, things like Stompy Tantrum, High Horsepower, and whatnot. And because of that also being 4x weak to ground types, having that Grass again is a very, very solid. Now, look, in terms of the moves, obviously Meteor Beam is the real winner this mon just got, right? Power Herb plus Meteor Beam is insane. Glimmora can really threaten a one-shot onto a lot of Pokemon. Like, I think it's one of like the few special attackers that can actually just straight up one-shot Fluttermanes on turn 1, which is actually kind of crazy. When you think about it, I believe too it can also one-shot Landorus Incarnates as well, or at least for the most part. I think it might be a roll for like non-bulky Landos, but still it's a roll in your favor, which is pretty crazy. And yeah, it's just an incredibly strong special attacker that also kind of deters, people really from trying to attack it, right? A lot of the metagame right now is very heavy on the physical end, and because of that, people don't really want to make contact with Glimmora. Not to mention, I do think the rock typing right now is very, very good, especially with things like the Qian Pao D-Night cores running around. It's very, very good into Qian Pao. It's like, hey, I don't really care about any of your moves. They all kind of make contact anyway, and because of that, it's just kind of whatever. And even D-Night as well, it's like, hey, you kind of can't just E-Speed spam me, right? I'm going to be able to tank it, and I can threaten a one-shot on you in return with the Meteor Beam, which is obviously very, very good. Now, in terms of the moves here, I did put Meteor Beam, Spiky Shield, and Sludge Bomb. I left the last slot open because this one really comes down to how you kind of want to run your team, right? I think if you're pairing this up with just some like standard Tornadus offense, for example, or just Tailwind offense, I think Earth Power is obviously fantastic. Obviously, with the Rock and the Poison types, or Rock and Poison coverage, sorry, you can't really hit the ground types because of that having the Steel types, because of that Earth Power is very, very good. I think as well, obviously, if you're pairing this up with something like Dondozo, Mortal Spin is definitely your way to go, because just basically spreading poison and then kind of allowing your team to stall it out and chip it down is obviously very, very good. And then, of course, if you really think your team needs, some more rock coverage, I do think Power Gem is just a fantastic last option, because obviously Meteor Beam late game can be very, very awkward, because it gets you into a position where it's like, damn, I've used my Power Herb, now I got to sit here and charge a turn. Because of that, I do think having Power Gem is potentially a very, very solid option. Now, for Volcarona, this is a one that I have actually been touching on quite a bit in the recent videos, and that is because I think Volcarona has an incredibly good matchup into the metagame. One, I think Quiver Dance is fantastic right now. This is a mon where I think just setup in general is really, really good. But obviously, Quiver Dance is fantastic because buffing up your special defense stat, especially when you're a mon that has a pretty decent SPDF stat anyway, and you naturally resist Fluttermane as it is, I think it is very, very good because it puts you in this position all of a sudden where you're not really that scared of like the main special attacker in the metagame, which is obviously a massive plus, right? And then obviously when you have access to things like Heat Wave to deal massive spread damage after getting up a Quiver Dance or two, that is fantastic. You kind of just chip them down. And then of course Giga Drain is always just really, really good for recovering back up and staying alive once you got a couple boosts. But the real main thing for me on this mon is Flame Body. Now obviously Flame Body is just a pretty broken ability, right? When you have a look at this mon, there is a 30% chance to burn anything that makes contact with you. And again, when you have a look at the current metagame, there are things like Urshifu Rapid Strike, even Urshifu Single as well to a certain extent. And then of course, you got things like Qian Pao and whatnot as well. And because of Flame Body, if you can ever get a burn on those mons, it really just kind of cripples them and puts you in a position where, with leftovers and Giga Drain, you can potentially, withstand their hyper offense pressure, kind of, get the burns on them, heal back up with Quiver Dance, with Giga Drain after a Quiver Dance, and then all of a sudden they can't remove this beast that is kind of just removing everything from their side of the board. And yeah, because of that, I think Volcarona is fantastic. In terms of Terras, I showed the two different sets here as they are essentially the same thing. We have Terra Dragon and we have Terra Grass. Terra Dragon is obviously just really good into things like Ogerpon. That's one of the biggest ones that you kind of have to worry about because, of course, a Terra Water Ivy Cudgel will just bop you. And then, of course, as well, there are a bunch of other things as well, right, that are just kind of annoying that obviously Dragon's just very, very good into, right? Obviously, you know, another main one being, of course, Urshifu Rapid Strike as well. And then on this set here, we just have Terra Grass. Again, Terra Grass is just really good into the water types. That is kind of what Volcarona is really the most scared of. Because of that, I do think having something like Terra Grass is also really good, especially if you are worried about, you know, something like your Amoonguss matchup. We also threw the Wiki Berry on here instead of Leftovers because, again, this is kind of obviously, you know, being a pinch berry. It's one of those things where lefties over time is more valuable, but, you know, if you need that quick burst of HP, obviously something like Wiki Berry or Citrus Berry is just a lot better. And then as well, I finally just added Fiery Dance on this set over the Heat Wave. Main thing really is Heat Wave can miss, and, you know, I've been in games where I really wished I had a single target move. Because of that, I do think Fiery Dance is definitely solid to have, especially too with its 50% chance to buff up your special attack by 1 stat. You know, if you could ever, you know, get, say, 4 of these off in a game, and all of a sudden after 1 Quiver Dance, you're +3, obviously that is really, really good. Now, in terms of the spreads here, this is just, I think, a very, very standard set for Volcarona. Basically, the 128 speed here with the 60 investment. After 1 Quiver Dance, I think you hit 192 off memory, which essentially outspeeds almost everything in the metagame, outside of things like, you know, Timid, Flutter Mane, you know, Jolly, Chen Pao. Obviously, you've got things like, what's it called, Iron Boulder now as well, Iron Bundle and Dragapult to the other two. But really, for the most part, nothing's really hitting 192, which I think is very good. And of course, after a +2, you're essentially outspeeding everything you need to. And then in terms of the investments, this is just hitting a bump. If you guys don't know what a bump is, basically, you know, you hit the 0 on your stat that you're buffing up with your nature. So in this case, you know, 160. Because if I run 1 less, you know, with a modest nature, I get 15 extra points. With, you know, 160, I get 16. So that's kind of a bump for anyone, I guess, who didn't understand that. And then it's just bulk. Just get as much physical defense as you can. Obviously, max out your HP because you want to, you know, get the most out of your lefties, your Wiki Berry, your Giga Drains. And then, of course, just pumping into physical defense because that is this mon's biggest issue is its physical defense. And I think this mon really liked pairing up with Redirection, potentially some healing from things like Amoonguss. And, of course, Intimidate. I think Intimidate is very, very important with something like Volcarona. And the main one really being kind of Landorus Therian form. I think Gyarados is also a decent option as well because Gyarados can run something like Taunt for you. Obviously, it can run, you know, T-Wave as well, which can be very annoying. And of course, Incin, you know, Double Fire, I do not think is a bad typing at all to have right now. Now, Baxcalibur is a mod I have actually spoken about quite a few times in the past, and that is because I was actually personally testing this mod. I do think Baxcalibur in Snow right now is really, really good, and I do actually think Alola Ninetales is also very, very strong right now. It's a very fast, you know, screen set with Aurora Veil. It also has access to things like Encore, which is very good, and I also just think in general the ice typing is fantastic right now, especially when you can spam out things like Blizzards, Freeze Dries, Icy Winds, and whatnot. But anyway, we're talking about Baxcalibur today. Obviously, with his ability Thermal Exchange, you can't be burnt by things like, obviously, Entei, which I think is very, very good. And also, you gain +1 attack if they do ever hit you with the, obviously, with the Sacred Fire. And again, I think just a physical attack up that can't be burnt, obviously, is very, very strong. Obviously, we have the Clear Amulet here because, again, Incinch is very, very annoying. And, of course, just a lot of the other, you know, Intimidate mods. A great one, for example, is Landorus Therian, because Landorus Therian essentially can't live an Adamant 252 Ice Shard without bulk. And of course, with the Clear Amulet, they can't drop your attack to kind of, you know, stall you out. Terra Poison is just the best Terra in my opinion for this mon. It's just too good. I've looked at other Terras like Steel Fire and whatnot. Poison's just the way to go, boys. Trust me on that one. It's very, very strong. Glavis Rush, this move is absolutely absurd. Obviously, the drawback on this move kind of sucks, but when you have things like Protect and Ice Shard, you can definitely work around it. And of course, SD on a mon that hits this damn hard is just always going to be broken. I'm pretty sure if you get +2, you can one-shot most Flutter Manes. I might be a little off on that calc. It might be just the very squishy Flutter Manes, but it does obviously deal a lot of damage. And I think this mon, again, is just, it's super bulky. You know, you don't need that much speed. Just dump it into HP, dump into your attack, and it just deals a lot of damage, right? But the other set we're going to look at here is the Loaded Dice set. Now, this set I do think definitely has a place in the metagame. It's very interesting, but it is very squishy. So you are kind of trading out that, you know, that bulk and hard hitting, but, you know, a bit squishier, but faster, and obviously, you know, the ability to sweep the game, you know, pretty damn quickly. Obviously, on a set like this, we are running max speed. Essentially, the reason for that is because after a scale shot, which obviously, for those who don't know, if you get it off, you get +1 speed. You essentially outspeed a majority of the metagame. I think you hit 208 off memory, which puts you faster than everything outside of Dragapult and Regieleki, which are two very, you know, uncommon mons right now. But of course, you know, you've got DD as well. DD buffing up your speed, buffing up your attacks. That's very, very nice. And then, of course, Loaded Dice just meaning like, hey, if you ever get these two moves off, you're guaranteed, you know, minimum base 100 attack, or at least on those two moves, which, again, coming off this attack stat is pretty damn absurd. But yeah, I think Baxcalibur is really, really good right now. It has a very solid matchup into the metagame. And of course, you know, I've said it a lot. I think the ice typing in particular right now is very, very strong, especially offensively. And look, we've seen that with Chen Pao being one of the best Pokemon in the game. Now, if you always want an answer to the, the shenanigans that are the Qian Pao, D-Knight, Entei stuff running around with the priority moves, I think Hisuian Arcanine is one of the best mons at dealing with it, right? This is the mon that naturally resists the E-Speed. Obviously, at 4x, resists the fire moves coming out of Entei. And of course, Qian Pao really can't hit this mon for that much damage. I don't think Sacred Swords even do 50% to this mon after a -1, which is obviously very, very strong. And of course, one of the worst things about D-Knight is, a lot of D-Knights right now want to run Choice Band. Obviously, they have Stomping Tantrum for things like, Hisuian Arcanine. But if you have to lock yourself into a banded Stomping Tantrum, it's a pretty bad time, especially because you are going to eat something like, a Stab Rock Slide coming off this mon. Now, in terms of sets, I do have 3 different sets here. The first one is the Choice Banded set. Now, the main reason I have the Choice Banded set here is because this one, I think, with the Jolly nature, being able to outrun things like Entei and then, threaten a one-shot with a, Choice Banded Head Smash, even at -1, I do think is very, very good. And 2, I think this mon just, it hits really hard. So, like, making sure that you go, faster than most of the Pokemon in the metagame, I do think is very, very solid. Because this mon will also outspeed things like, an Urshifu without a Choice Scarf, for example, the Mystic Water sets, which I do think, obviously, it's not a great matchup, don't get me wrong, but the ability to, come in and potentially just throw off an E-Speed or a Flare Blitz, making sure you've got, like, reliable damage into it is obviously very, very good. Now, I realize I just said E-Speed. E-Speed doesn't matter about, you being a Jolly nature, but of course, having it there is definitely solid. I do think you could run something like Adamant, but right now, I think, if you're running Hisuian Arcanine, the main job for this mon really is to get out damage, and because of that, I do think the Banded just Jolly Max set is probably the best way to go. Though another option here is the Clear Amulet set. Now, again, very, very similar to what we just said there is I think this mon really wants to make sure it goes first. And because of that, we've got Clear Amulet. I've stuck to the Jolly Max again. Now, I'm not 100% too sure if this is the best way to play it. It probably isn't. I do think a little bit of bulk on Arcanine is probably worth it. But I do think, again, going first, especially on like a Rock Slide mon, is very, very good. Now, I did change the Terra type on this one to Fairy just because, again, I'm personally not a massive fan of going Terra Normal. I think normal is probably okay if you are pairing it up with something like Qian Pao, but my biggest issue with the Terra Normal on, something like Hisuian Arcanine is not removing your weakness to fighting types, and especially when the Urshifus are very good, even things like Iron Hands, which I expect to kind of pick back up later, knowing that they have a free close combat into you or Drain Punch or whatever it is, obviously is very, very scary, and because of that, I do think Terra Fairy is definitely a solid option. And then for the final set though here, it really is just the kind of a bulkier Citrus Berry set. Now, Terra Grass was the last one I put here. You could also run something like Terra Fairy plus Safety Goggles if you wanted. Grass obviously is just a fantastic resistance to things like, obviously the ground types, the water types that both 4x hit you. But it's also really good into something like a Moongus because you just, ignore the spores, ignore the Rage Powders. And on this set here, we are Citrus Berry plus Will-O-Wisp. I do think Will-O-Wisp in this current metagame is very, very good. Obviously, the ability to just, straight up resist things like Power Knight and then just throw off a Will-O-Wisp. And then, you get to a situation where the second turn, it's like, okay, well, potentially like, hey, Qian Pao, you're -1. I've just burnt your D-Knight. I'm actually kind of not that scared now about like a potential double up into me once again. And because of that, you can threaten another burn onto the other mon, which I do think is obviously very, very good. And I do think having, a fast Will-O-Wisp is very solid. And again, that's why we just stuck to Jolly Max. I really feel like this mon right now kind of has to be max speed. But obviously with Blitz and Rock Slide, you don't need that much investment for this one to actually get a lot of mileage out of its offensive stats. Now, Gouging Fire here is another pretty decent fire type right now. I do think this one gets a little bit slept on. It is kind of heavily hated, I think, by a lot of, top players, but I do think, obviously stats don't lie. This one had a very good win rate into a lot of the top Pokemon, but 2, I do think just in general, it is very, very solid. So the first set we have here is the Booster Energy Howl set. Now, I personally do think this is the best way to play it. This one, I think, pairs incredibly well with a lot of these Qian Pao cores, especially in that Entei slot. And essentially what this mon wants to do is say, hey, I can howl at my allies, right? I can, howl at my Ogerpons, my Rillabooms, my Qian Paos, my D-Knights if I have a D-Knight, right? You just basically buff up a lot of these really strong physical attackers. But you can also say like, hey, I'm like the fastest thing on the board. I'm going to Breaking Swipe. Like, it's really good into the mirror matchups as well, going up against things like opposing Power Knight. Because it's like, hey, I'm really bulky. Are you really going to risk the Burning Bulwark on me right now? Like, if you make physical contact with me, I'm going to burn you, yeah? But if you ignore me, I'm going to Breaking Swipe you. And I'm also going to be faster than you, right? So you better hope you're clicking E-Speeds, right? And then like Heat Crash is good. Obviously buffing up your allies is good. Terra Grass, again, is just really good because like 1, it covers that ground weakness. But 2, just being able to ignore a Moongus, I think is very, very good, right? The next set, though, is the Clear Amulet set. This is the Dragon Dance set. I probably should actually touch on the EVs here real quick as well, actually, before I kind of get onto the next one. Also, I just realized that's not how this mon should be run. I'm a noob. That's a bad set. I copied the wrong set, boys. I apologize. But yeah, I think I had something like that off memory. I think that was my spread there. Something like that. With the Booster Energy, again, you can run Jolly if you want. Sorry, you can run... Actually, I don't think you can afford to run Adamant, right? Adamant hits too hard. Yeah, you can't run Adamant. You have to run Jolly on this set. Obviously, it depends on how much bulk you want. I do think you kind of want to go max HP on this one, sorry. But yeah, obviously you want to make sure you get that speed booster. That's very important. I do apologize for stuffing that up. Yeah, you want to really make sure you get the speed booster because obviously getting the booster speed is very, very important on this one. But yeah, this one, you kind of just want to be bulky, howl up your allies. And of course, when you got 136 attack, it's like nothing too crazy. But if you howl up your allies, obviously you buff yourself, all of a sudden you start hitting for over 200. And now you're doing some real goddamn damage, right? Anyway, moving over to the the clear amulet set. So this is what I was about to get into with the speed stat. So the reason you run 143 is this one speed ties with Landorus Therian form. So essentially what you kind of want to do is just, get up that DD on this set. You clear amulet, so obviously you can't be intimidated. You get up the DD, and now all of a sudden you're as fast as like a Choice Scarf Landorus, right? And then if you ever get to +2, you essentially outspeed the entire metagame. And there's a lot of ones that even under Tailwind that you'll definitely outspeed because they'll always run to around that 137 to 140 tier. Obviously some will run faster, but being able to outspeed some things obviously is very, very solid. Now, I did throw Terra Fairy on this set, but I do think Grass is probably the better option. Fairy obviously is just really good into opposing dragons. It just means you don't lose to things like Calm Mind, Raging Bolt. Even just like the Goggle variants of Bolt, I think it's very good into as well. In terms of the EVs though, again, we went over the speed. This is just hitting the bump on the physical attack. And then this mon's defensive stats are so high, they don't really need investment. That's why we kind of just dump into HP. Very similar to what we did here, right? Because again, like you just get your most bang for your buck, just essentially investing all your stats here into the HP stat. And then the final set here is just like the bulkier Rocky Helmet set. Now this again is another Howl set. I do think this kind of functions a bit better on slower, Qian Pao teams. Obviously, one thing I said before, it pairs really well with Rillaboom. I do think Rillaboom is one of the best partners for this mon because just, either one, buffing up its Woodhammer for it obviously is very, very good. But two, if you could ever like fake out Howl and buff up its Grassy Glide, all of a sudden it's dealing like massive damage. Obviously that's very, very good. Breaking Swipe and Heat Crash, I do think are two of the best moves. I didn't really touch on it here. I did throw Dragon Claw and Flare Blitz. They're just other options. Like, I do think Heat Crash in general is better, but there are a couple heavier mons where Flare Blitz is just the better option. And of course, Dragon Claw, if you want to deal more damage, is better. That's why I put it on the DD set in particular. But again, I do think Breaking Swipe and Heat Crash are just very, very good. And of course, Burning Bulwark being a signature move is just very, very solid. And then Terra Water is just, again, a very neutral typing. I think it's very solid on something like, Gouging Fire because its defensive stats are so nice. So just having a nice, neutral Terra is always, it's always pretty solid. Now, I'm going to spoil the last one when talking about T-Tar here in particular. We're going to be talking about Sand. Now, I did kind of touch on it a little bit yesterday, but I do think Sand is incredibly good right now into the metagame. Essentially, when you look at the top 10 mons in the metagame, the combination of Tyranitar plus Excadrill essentially beats like 8 of the top 10, with the only two it doesn't beat was like, obviously Ogerpon Water and like Urshifu Rapid Strike, but they're both water types, and there's ways around that, right? You can pair something like Gastrodon up with Rain. You can obviously, with Sand, you can obviously put your own Ogerpon Water on the team as well to kind of make up for it. But anyway, T-Tar here, I do think this one's incredibly good right now. Obviously, it is weak to, the fighting type moves, which obviously things like Chen Pao and, of course, Urshifu and whatnot do run. But that's where Terra comes in, really, really well here on T-Tar. Now, I do think Terra Flying is very, very good, and it's the set I've got here because, in particular, one of the Excadrill sets we're about to talk about does have Terra Flying on it. But two, I actually do think it's a set I haven't shown here. But I do think, the Sand Cores in particular do actually pair really well with Psy Spam. And because of that, you can also always opt for something like Terra Psychic. Plus, does this thing get Psychic Fangs? I forget if it's Psychic Fangs or... Yeah, you have to run Terra Blast Psychic. But yeah, you can run like Terra Blast Psychic as well in Psychic terrain. It does a lot of goddamn damage. But yeah, really, this is just the very standard Salt Vest set. I ran this back at OCIC last year. I think it's just very, very good. You hit the, the bump on the attack stat. If you pair this thing up with Tailwind, it obviously outspeeds everything under Tailwind, not named Reggie or Lecky. And this one's just so damn bulky that you kind of just, dump whatever you have left into HP. But yeah, I think T-Tar has a very, very solid matchup into the metagame. But it is a very, very Terra-reliant mon. But of course, I think with something like Excadrill, you can kind of play around it. Now, the other set I did want to show off here is the Focus Sash set. Now, this is one that has actually started picking up in usage, which is kind of crazy to me. Because, like, I don't think the Sash set is, like, that good. But obviously, when it's one of the most used options on the mon, you do kind of have to show it off, right? Now, obviously, with Focus Sash here, I did opt for Terra Grass. The main reason for that really is because something like Urshifu Rapid Strike will obviously just kill you through your Sash. So you want to make sure you do resist those water-type moves so you can kind of, live a bit better there. Rock Slide and Knockoff are just two main stabs. Obviously, Rock Slide coming off this attack stat is always going to deal a lot of damage. And of course, Knockoff is just great utility, but it is also just a very, very strong stab move on Dark types. Now, Terra Blast again was just because T-Tar's coverage, while it isn't too bad, it really does like having its Terra Blast being Flying, Psychic, or Grass, all because they hit Urshifu Rapid Strike, which obviously is one of the biggest threats to T-Tar in general. And of course, you know, we're a Sash mon, so I've slapped Protect on there. Obviously, T-Tar is a very, very bulky mon, but making sure it can live one super effective hit, something like, you know, a close combat, a Sacred Sword, obviously is very, very valuable. And because of that, you know, I do have the Focus Sash set there, just so you guys do know about it. Now, as I did just say, obviously, Excadrill is the last mon here. This mon obviously has a fantastic matchup into Fluttermane with Sandic and outspeed booster, you know, Fluttermanes. Therefore, you know, Fluttermane does kind of need to be paired with Tailwind. But in general, it just outspeeds a majority of the metagame, right? There are a lot of choice scarfers this thing just outspeeds. And of course, it hits really goddamn hard, and it's a very good steel type, right? It absolutely loves the addition of close combat. It is one of the best ground types in the game in terms of just firing off big damage. And it also has access to Swords Dance. If you can ever get this mod into a position where it's in sand and it gets up a Swords Dance, it will absolutely just start sweeping through. And with Terra Dragon as well, you cover a lot of your weaknesses. Obviously being weak to, you know, water, neutral to grass, and of course weak to fire. Having Terra Dragon is just really good. It covers up a lot of your main weaknesses. And honestly, Terra Dragon on steel types is just really, really good. In terms of the speed cert, as I said, I think I may have already mentioned it actually. I might be repeating myself here. 140 outspeeds essentially everything. I think Regieleki hits 277 off the top of my head. So it outspeeds absolutely everything in the metagame. That's why we go Adamant. It's very, very good. And on this set here, I do have Jolly. This was actually a placeholder. Before I did it, I was kind of umming and ahhing between Adamant. I do think Adamant is better, guys. But again, I'm just kind of showing you Jolly as just an option. Essentially, Jolly will allow you to outspeed a lot of things under Tailwind. For example, if you go up against a Torn Urshi, they've got to sit there and say, all right, well, this is fine. I can go Rain and then, you know, just outspeed the Excadrill. I was like, well, I'm actually a Jolly nature, so you can't. And then two, of course, there are just other mons that will, you know, just go for it. Like, for example, Modest Chius will hit 152. This hits 154. I do think Adamant's better, though. I will say that. Go Adamant. But if you're really, really worried about losing the mirror, obviously, Jolly's definitely an option. Now, on this set, we are Choice Bandit. I do think Bandit has a lot of potential, especially because, you know, when we talked about T-Tar with Terra Flying being very, very solid, you know, a Banded Terra Ground Earthquake is very, very strong. Especially if this one moves first, it's dealing a lot of damage. Of course, we have the high horsepower. This could also be Stomping Tantrum if you don't want to risk the miss. That's completely up to you. Obviously, Iron Head is its other main stab. And then, of course, you know, double Rock Slide spam. It's just always a good thing. You know, if you just have a T-Tar and an Excadrill both sitting there clicking Rock Slides, you're going to flinch something eventually. And it's going to deal a lot of damage. And honestly, I think Sand is... I don't want to say it's the call for Charlotte because it definitely does have some pretty average matchups. Tornadoes can change whether, you know, Ogerpon and Urshifu are two of the best bonds in the metagame. But obviously, that's why you have 4 other slots on the team, and you can kind of build around that, right? But anyway, guys, that is it for, you know, 10 of the most underrated Pokemon right now. Again, I feel bad, you know, even calling this an underrated list because there are some mons obviously on this list that are good. Urshifu Single Strike, I think, is kind of... Like, this is probably the last time I'll ever be able to talk about this mon being underrated because I would not be surprised if it cracks the top 12 most used mons at Charlotte. And then, of course, things like Glimmora, again, is another one that's on the rise. Even Ogerpon Grass, you know, the Teal Mask variant, a lot of people are realizing, hey, this is good. I forget the player. I want to say it was Paul Chua as well. Has been, you know, spamming Volcarona. So, again, maybe not underrated. Hisuian Arcanine, people are starting to realize, like, hey, there's a reason it won 6, you know, regionals and Reg E. But, yeah, that's my list, guys. Let me know what you think of it down below. But, yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.